Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Thank you. Uh, I have to say, today is going to be a pretty heavy lift. We're really stripping away the veneer of everyday political rhetoric to look at the actual machinery underneath.
I'm ready for it. So, where exactly are we pointing the spotlight today?
Well, we are conducting a deep dive into a text called The Common Good. It's a collection of interviews with Noam Chomsky conducted by David Barsamian. But I need to be very clear right out of the gate here. This is not a book review.
Okay. So we aren't, like, discussing his writing style or giving it a star rating out of 5 or anything like that.
Not at all. We're treating this text purely as a data set. I mean, think of it as a set of stolen blueprints for a building that we've been living in our whole lives, but, never really understood how it was wired. We are looking for the identity of the political economy we currently live in.
That sounds slightly ominous. The identity of the political economy. Does this identity have a specific name?
It does. If you take the arguments in these interviews and you synthesize them, if you look at the actual evidence presented, the system isn't just capitalism, and it certainly isn't democracy. It is a neoliberal corporate oligarchy.
Whoa. Okay. That is a mouthful of buzzwords. Neoliberal corporate oligarchy. I feel like we need to just pause right there for a second.
Yeah.
Before we get into the weeds, you really need to sell me on why that specific combination of words matters to anyone listening.
It matters because it describes a massive contradiction. We're talking about a system where power is heavily concentrated in private hands, so that's the oligarchy part, but it operates within supposedly democratic institutions.
Right.
And it often effectively neutralizes those institutions.
Yeah.
And crucially, it creates this reality where the common good, meaning the well-being of you, me, the listener, our neighbors, is structurally subordinated to private profit.
Subordinated, meaning it's not just that they, prioritize profit, but that the system is literally built to put the public second.
Exactly. It's structural. And our mission today is to trace exactly how that machine works. So we're going to break this down into 5 distinct phases.
Okay.
We will look at the design, the incentives driving the people in charge, the outcomes that produces, why it persists the persistence, and finally, how it all interconnects into one big feedback loop.
I'm strapped in. Where do we even begin with a claim that big?
We start with the water we swim in. If you ask the average person on the street, or frankly, even the average economist on television, what kind of economy we live in, what do they usually say?
They'd probably say a free market. Capitalist, free trade. That's the standard textbook answer.
Right. Free market is basically the religion of the era. But the source material throws out a statistic early on that completely stops you in your tracks. It totally challenges that fundamental definition.
Yeah.
Chomsky notes that something like 40% of what the U.S. government classifies as trade isn't actually trade at all.
Wait, 40%? That's almost half.
Nearly half, yes.
If it's not trade, what is it?
It is internal administration. Let's make this concrete for the listener. Imagine you are the Ford Motor Company.
Okay.
You have a factory in Indiana making transmissions, and you have an assembly plant in Illinois.
I'm with you.
If you ship that transmission from Indiana to Illinois, is that considered trade?
No, of course not. You're just moving your own stuff around. That's inventory management.
Precisely. It's an internal transfer within one entity. Now imagine Ford owns an assembly plant in northern Mexico. If they ship that exact same transmission from Illinois to their own factory in Mexico, the U.S. government suddenly logs that as an export.
Huh.
And when the finished car comes back across the border, it's logged as an import.
I see. So on the books, it looks like international trade. It looks like the U.S. selling to Mexico and Mexico selling back to the U.S.
But structurally,
yeah.
economically, it is the exact same transaction as moving it from Indiana to Illinois. It is a centrally managed decision made by a totalitarian institution.
Hold on, totalitarian? That's a really charged word. Usually we reserve that for, like, dictatorships. Stalin, Mussolini, that sort of thing.
It is charged, but Chomsky uses it very deliberately here, in a structural sense. Think about a modern corporation. Is it a democracy?
Well, definitely not. You don't vote for your boss.
Exactly. It is a strict top-down hierarchy. Orders come from the top, and they are executed at the bottom. The people actually doing the daily work have absolutely zero say in the strategy or the distribution of profits. That is the literal definition of a totalitarian structure.
Right.
So when Ford moves that transmission across the border, they aren't participating in a free market. They aren't selling it to a competitor to see who has the best price. They're just moving assets from one room of their own house to another room. It just so happens that room is in a different country.
Okay, but why does that distinction actually matter? Why should you or I care if an economist calls it trade or an internal transfer? It just sounds like semantics.
It's not just semantics, because you have to look at why they do it. They aren't moving the part to find a better customer. They are doing it to exploit what economists call labor arbitrage.
Labor arbitrage, meaning finding the cheapest possible labor.
Yes. They are moving the part to a room where the people are vastly cheaper and where environmental and labor regulations are basically non-existent.
So the whole free trade rhetoric is basically a cover story for something else.
It's camouflage. It allows massive companies to escape the regulations, the taxes, and the labor costs of the United States, while still claiming to be proud American companies participating in the grand global free market.
Wow.
So when you hear the news anchor saying global trade is booming, almost half of that is just massive corporations talking to themselves to avoid paying a living wage.
That really changes how I picture the economy. It's less like a bustling, competitive marketplace and more like, I don't know, a network of private pipelines.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Yes, private pipelines. And this brings us right into phase one, which is the design. We really have to look at the architecture of this system, because if it's not a free market, what actually is it?
You mentioned the specific term earlier when we were prepping for this, really existing market theory.
Yes. Chomsky loves these slightly dry academic terms that hide a very cynical reality. Really existing market theory is the true operating system of our oligarchy. And it can be summed up in basically one sentence. Market discipline is for the poor and the middle class, but the rich get state protection.
That feels like a massive contradiction. I mean, usually the people shouting the loudest about the virtues of the free market are the richest people in the room. They are the ones constantly talking about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
That is the public rhetoric, absolutely. But look at the historical data. The text points to the Reagan administration as the perfect case study for this. Now, when you think of Ronald Reagan, what immediately comes to mind?
Government is the problem. Deregulation. The invisible hand. He is basically the patron saint of free market capitalism.
That is the mythology.
Yeah.
But the common good highlights the actual data from that era. The Reagan administration was actually the most protectionist in post-war American history.
Really? How so? I've never heard that.
They virtually doubled import restrictions. When U.S. manufacturers like the auto industry, the steel industry, when they couldn't compete with Japan or Germany, did Reagan look at them and say, well, that's the free market. You just have to sink or swim?
I'm guessing not, based on where this is going.
No, not at all.
Mm.
He built massive economic walls. He literally forced Japan to limit their auto exports to save American corporations. It was called voluntary export restraints. But there was nothing voluntary about it. He used the massive power of the federal state to protect private wealth from the risks of actual competition.
So it's essentially socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
It is the absolute privatization of profit and the socialization of risk. And the fascinating thing here is that this isn't some modern corruption of a once pure system. This isn't just something that went wrong in the 80s or 90s. This goes all the way back to the original blueprints of the country. We need to talk about the Madisonian blueprint.
Madison. James Madison. Father of the Constitution.
The very same. Now, usually, in a high school civics class, we group the founding fathers with the ancient Greeks, Athens, as the great architects of democracy. We put Madison and Aristotle on the exact same team.
Sure. Democracy started in Athens. We lost it for a while, and then we revived it in 1776. That's the standard narrative.
But the source material argues that if you actually read their original texts, Madison and Aristotle were political opposites. They looked at the exact same systemic problem, which is inequality, and they came to diametrically opposite conclusions about how to handle it.
Opposite? In what way?
Let's start with Aristotle. He looked at Athens and he saw a fundamental structural problem. He said, if you have a true democracy where the majority actually rules, and you have a society with a few very rich people and a massive amount of poor people, what is the logical outcome?
Well, the poor are the majority, so they'll just vote to take the rich people's money.
Exactly. They will use their democratic voting power to pursue the common good by redistributing the wealth. Aristotle saw this clear as day. So he realized society had a choice. You can either reduce democracy or you can reduce inequality.
And which way did Aristotle go?
He chose to reduce inequality. He argued that for a democracy to actually survive and be stable, you needed shared prosperity. He called it for public meals, land distribution. He wanted to lift the bottom up so that the majority wasn't so desperate that they'd tear the system apart.
Okay, that sounds incredibly progressive for ancient Greece. Fix inequality to save democracy. So what was Madison's take?
Madison looked at the newly formed United States in 1787 and saw the exact same dynamic. He knew that if the general population had real, unified democratic power, they would implement what he called land reform. They would break up the great estates of the wealthy class.
Which Madison probably didn't like, considering he was a very wealthy landowner himself.
Right, he was deeply invested in that wealth. And he was remarkably explicit about this fear at the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah.
The records are all there. He literally argued that the primary goal of government should be to, and this is a quote, protect the minority of the opulent against the majority.
Wait, that is a direct quote from the father of the Constitution, protect the minority of the opulent.
Yes, that was the explicit Madisonian intent. So unlike Aristotle, Madison chose the other path. Instead of reducing inequality to save democracy, he decided to heavily reduce democracy to protect inequality.
That's a massive shift in perspective. We usually think of the checks and balances in our government. You know, the Senate, the Electoral College, the separation of powers. We think of those as ways to prevent tyranny, to stop a dictator or a king.
And they're designed to stop a king.
Mm.
But they are equally designed to prevent what they call the tyranny of the majority. They are fundamentally designed to fragment the public.
Right.
Think about it. If you break the population into different states, different voting districts, if you set the House against the Senate, the federal government against the state government, it becomes incredibly difficult for the poor majority to ever organize and act in unison to change the economic structure.
Wow. It's essentially a gridlock machine.
It's a fragmentation machine.
Yeah.
The design ensures that the more capable set of men, which was their polite term for the wealthy merchant and landowning class, remains firmly in charge of the actual levers of power.
So when we look at our politics today, where it constantly feels like public opinion just doesn't matter, where the common good always seems to lose out to corporate interests and investor rights, Chomsky is saying that isn't the system breaking down.
No. He is saying that is the system working perfectly. It is the political software running exactly as it was coded in 1787.
That is genuinely a chilling thought. If the design itself is the root problem, then just voting harder or electing a slightly better politician isn't going to fix it.
Exactly. You can't vote your way out of a blueprint. And this design doesn't just sit statically on paper. It actively creates a set of incentives for the people who operate within it, which moves us perfectly into phase 2, the incentive architecture. Because even if you have fundamentally good people, if you put them in a bad design, what happens?
The design wins.
The design always wins. And to understand this, we need to talk about the rotten barrel. We constantly hear people complain about corporate greed or bad apples in the business world. You know, the argument, if we just had more ethical CEOs, if we just had socially responsible business leaders, everything would be fine.
Right. We love to demonize the individual. We say, oh, that guy's a shark, he's greedy, or we see a massive corporate scandal and think, well, they just need to fire the executive board and hire better people.
But the source material argues that this perspective misses the point entirely. We have to look at the legal and structural obligations of the CEO role itself. Let's play a little game to illustrate this. Imagine you are the CEO of a massive multinational shoe company.
Okay, I am the CEO. I've got the corner office, the fantastic view, the nice suit. I'm in charge.
You have massive production factories in Indonesia. The text describes a very common scenario where women are working 12 hours a day in incredibly hazardous conditions, breathing in toxic fumes for wages that barely keep them alive. It is a textbook sweatshop.
Not a great visual, obviously, but sadly very realistic.
Now imagine you, the CEO, sitting in that corner office, have a sudden crisis of conscience. You wake up one day and say, I'm a human being. I simply cannot treat other human beings this way. So you decide to use some of your company's record profits to install air conditioning, vastly improve safety standards, and pay those workers a genuine living wage. Okay, I do the moral thing. I become the good guy CEO. I use my power for good.
What immediately happens to you?
Well, my production costs go up, so my quarterly earnings go down.
And then what?
The stock price drops. The major institutional shareholders get angry because they aren't making as much money.
And then they sue you. Or the board of directors just outright fires you. And the crucial point here is they are legally right to do so.
Wait, legally right? Because I helped people.
Yes. In this system, you have a strict legal fiduciary duty to maximize profit and market share for the owners of the company. By prioritizing the common good of those Indonesian workers over the financial profit of the shareholders, you are actually failing the explicit legal definition of your job. So if I act like a compassionate, moral human being, I literally lose the job.
Instantly. And the person who replaces you will purposely be someone who's perfectly willing to do what you wouldn't. The system aggressively selects for ruthlessness.
That is the rotten barrel concept. It's not that the individual apples are inherently bad, it's that the barrel itself turns them brown. If you put a good apple in, it still rots.
It forces them to be functionally sociopathic in their professional roles, regardless of how nice they might be to their kids at home. And this incentive structure, this relentless drive to socialize cost and privatize profit, it doesn't just apply to how they treat labor. It applies to massive financial risk. And this is where we get into one of the absolute biggest myths of our modern economy, which is corporate welfare.
Oh, this is a big one. Because in the media, we always hear about welfare queens or people exploiting the system at the bottom. The narrative is always about poor people taking government handouts. But we rarely hear about the massive welfare state at the very top.
Exactly. The text explicitly calls it risk socialization. The basic operating rule of the current neoliberal system is this. If you make a profit, it's privately yours to keep. But if you make a massive mistake, the taxpayer gets the bill.
It's the ultimate heads I win, tails you lose economy.
Perfectly stated. And there is a historical case study in the book that perfectly illustrates this dynamic. The Mexican bailout of the 1990s. Do you remember the broad strokes of this?
Vaguely. I remember seeing headlines about the Mexican economy collapsing, defaulting on loans, and the U.S. government stepping in to be a good neighbor and save them.
That was exactly the public narrative. We need to help our struggling friends to the south. But let's actually look at the mechanics of the money. Who actually held all that Mexican debt that was failing?
I would assume big international banks.
Specifically, New York investment banks. They had loaned billions and billions of dollars to Mexico at exceptionally high interest rates. Now, why were those interest rates so high to begin with?
Because loaning to a developing economy is risky. That's just how lending works, right? Higher risk means you charge a higher interest rate to cover the potential loss.
Exactly. That is capitalism 101. High risk, high reward. The banks made a calculated bet. They collected the enormous high interest for years. But when the risk actually materialized, when the Mexican economy faltered, and they couldn't pay what should have happened, according to free market theory.
The banks should have taken the loss. They made a bad bet, so they lose their shirts. The market disciplines them.
But that is absolutely not what happened. The U.S. government stepped in with a massive, multi-billion-dollar bailout. But the money didn't go to the Mexican people to help their economy recover. The money passed virtually straight through Mexico and went directly into the vaults of the New York investment banks to make them completely whole.
So the U.S. taxpayer effectively paid off the bad gambling debts of Wall Street billionaires.
We guaranteed their risk. The public paid the premium, and the private banks kept the entire payout. It's basically a massive insurance policy that the banks never have to pay a dime for, provided they're big enough and powerful enough to demand it from the state.
That really completely shatters the free market rhetoric. I mean, if you or I start a small business, restaurant or something, and it fails because we made a bad bet, no one is coming from Washington to bail us out. We just lose our savings.
No, you face severe market discipline. The banks, however, get robust state protection. And this phenomenon isn't just limited to high finance and banking. It is actually the core engine of the entire high-tech economy that we rely on today.
Okay, wait, now you're coming for Silicon Valley.
I absolutely am, because the source material goes deep into this. We culturally love to celebrate the entrepreneurial genius of tech moguls, the myth of the brilliant guy in his garage inventing the future. But the common good forces us to look at the actual historical receipts. Where did the internet actually come from?
Well, originally it was DARPA, right? The military.
Exactly. And where did the microprocessor come from? Or satellite communication? Or GPS?
Those were all massive government programs funded by taxpayers.
Yes. For over 30 years, the fundamental research and development of the core technologies of the digital age was funded entirely by the public sector, mostly routed through the Pentagon and state universities. The public paid for all the R&D. The public took 100% of the massive financial risk that these technologies might never actually work or be viable.
And then once all the hard work was done and it became commercially profitable,
it was seamlessly handed over to private tyranny, Companies like Microsoft, Apple, IBM, they built their entire sprawling empires on a technological foundation that was paid for and poured by the American taxpayer. The text even mentions the semiconductor industry, specifically a consortium called Semitech. In the 1980s, when U.S. chip makers were getting absolutely crushed by Japanese competition, did they just go to their garages and innovate their way out of it using the magic of the free market?
I'm guessing they picked up the phone and called Washington, D.C.
They absolutely did. The federal government stepped in, formed a massive consortium, poured in enormous amounts of public money, and centrally managed the recovery of the private tech industry. So when these incredibly wealthy tech executives lecture the public about the virtues of the free market and rugged individualism, we need to laugh. They do not want a free market. They despise the free market. They want state power. They want the government to subsidize their massive costs and protect them from foreign competition while they pocket all the resulting profits.
It seems like there's a very clear pattern here. The incentives at the top are all geared toward capturing the state to shield the powerful from any actual risk. But what about the incentives regarding the rest of us, the workers?
This is the very dark side of the incentive coin. While the system builds these incredibly comfortable safety nets for corporations, it actively and aggressively dismantles them for regular people. The text deeply analyzes welfare reform, which was a huge political topic in the 90s, not as a necessary budget-saving measure, but as a calculated strategic move to artificially increase the labor supply.
Strategic. I always just thought the argument was about cutting government spending and lowering the deficit.
The amounts saved by cutting welfare were incredibly trivial in the grand scheme of the federal budget. It was basically a rounding error. But look at the structural effect. If you completely destroy the social safety net, people become utterly desperate. They have no fallback, so they had to take any job at any terrible wage under any awful condition just to survive and feed their kids. When you flood the job market with millions of newly desperate workers, what automatically happens to the overall price of labor?
It goes down, just basic supply and demand. If 100 people are desperate for one job, the boss can offer minimum wage.
Exactly. It drives down wages for everyone across the board, not just those coming off the welfare rolls. It massively reduces the bargaining power of established unions. Chomsky actually quotes the mainstream business press from that era on this camp. They weren't even hiding it. They openly celebrated what they called capital's clear subjugation of labor. The explicit goal was to make the working class deeply insecure.
Because insecure workers are terrified workers. They don't ask for raises. They don't form unions or go on strike. They just keep their heads down and try not to get fired.
And they certainly don't have the time or energy to demand common good political policies because they're too busy just trying to survive the week. This is the incentive architecture working absolutely perfectly to maintain the rigid hierarchy of the oligarchy.
Which leads us incredibly smoothly into phase 3, the outcomes. Because if you intentionally design a system to endlessly protect immense wealth and simultaneously discipline and terrorize labor, the physical results in the real world should be pretty predictable.
They are entirely predictable. And one of the most visible, tragic outcomes is the intentional destruction of public infrastructure, all done in the name of efficiency.
The efficiency myth. We hear this constantly. The public sector is bloated and slow, and the private sector is inherently more efficient. But the question is always efficient for whom?
That is the essential question you always have to ask. The text gives a really heartbreaking, concrete example from Trinidad. Under what global institutions call structural adjustment programs, which is basically just a polite term for brutal austerity plans imposed by Western finance, Trinidad was forced to eliminate crucial public bus routes for the poor.
To save the government money, presumably.
Yes, to balance the state ledger for the international creditors. But the physical result on the ground was that poor workers now had to take relatively expensive private taxis just to get to their jobs. The cost of daily transportation didn't vanish. It was merely shifted from the public ledger directly into the pockets of the poorest citizens. Now, here is the incredibly twisted kicker to this story. Under standard economic metrics, the GDP of Trinidad actually goes up in this scenario.
Wait, how does the GDP go up if the actual people are demonstrably worse off and poorer?
Because more money is rapidly changing hands in the private market. The workers are spending far more of their limited income on private taxis, on gasoline, on private car repairs. The sheer volume of economic activity increases. So the economy looks much bigger and healthier on a Wall Street spreadsheet. But the actual lived quality of life for the human being has plummeted. That is what the system calls efficiency. It's efficiency for capital extraction, but absolute misery for the human being.
It reminds me of that old dark economic joke that a massive multi-car pileup in a traffic jam is actually fantastic for the GDP because of all the money spent on tow trucks, hospital bills, and buying new cars.
It's exactly that logic. And we don't just see this in developing nations. We have a massive domestic example of this right here in the U.S., the Los Angeles streetcar conspiracy.
I've heard rumors about this for years. Was it an actual conspiracy or just a myth about urban planning gone wrong?
It was a literal court-proven conspiracy. Los Angeles used to have a phenomenal, highly efficient, incredibly popular electric rail system called the Red Cars. But General Motors, Firestone Tires, and Chevron, which was Standard Oil of California at the time, formed front companies, systematically bought up the electric rail system and literally dismantled it.
Wait, they didn't try to improve it or run it profitably, they just bought it to scrap it?
They physically destroyed the tracks and burned the cars to intentionally force the entire population of Los Angeles into a total reliance on private automobiles, gasoline, and rubber tires. This wasn't a natural market choice where individual consumers collectively decided they'd rather sit in suffocating smog and traffic on the 405 freeway. It was deliberate, top-down social engineering by concentrated private power to forcefully create a massive captive market for their products.
That really profoundly reframes how you look at modern American cities. We look at endless traffic and crumbling roads and we just think, oh, poor urban planning or incompetent local government. But in a very real way, it's actually highly successful corporate planning.
Precisely. It is a system functioning exactly as designed. Another major outcome we have to look at is the race to the bottom. We talked about capital mobility and labor arbitrage earlier. The text highlights a perfect modern example, the Daimler-Benz Corporation. This is a massive, highly profitable German auto manufacturer. They decided they wanted to open a new manufacturing plant in the United States.
And instead of just picking the best location, they pitted states against each other.
Yes. They basically set up an auction between Alabama and North Carolina. The question wasn't who has the best workforce. The question was who is willing to offer us the biggest bribe. Which state will gut their own tax base the most, offer the most free land, the most taxpayer subsidies, just to win the bid?
So millions of dollars in public funds, money that could and should go to local public schools or hospitals or repairing bridges, are instead being used to essentially pay a multi-billion-dollar foreign corporation just to set up shop.
And this intentionally strips resources from the community. It literally forces local states to cannibalize their own vital tax bases. It is a highly efficient, structural mechanism that transfers massive amounts of wealth from the public sector directly to the private sector, and it's all justified under the magical guise of job creation.
The text also mentions Eastern Europe in this specific context of outcomes, which I found really fascinating and completely contrary to the standard historical narrative. We usually hear about the fall of the Soviet Union as this glorious triumph of free market democracy, bringing prosperity to the oppressed.
Chomsky offers a radically different, structurally based perspective on that era. He argues that for Eastern Europe, the outcome of the Cold War ending wasn't a glorious transition to Western-style democratic prosperity. Instead, it was a yes. The structural outcome is a highly stratified two-tier society. You see a massive, almost incomprehensible concentration of wealth at the very, very top, which is where the famous Russian and Eastern European oligarchs come from. They bought up all the formerly public state assets for pennies on the dollar. And meanwhile, the vast majority of the general population faces unprecedented economic stagnation, the loss of their pensions, and constant job insecurity. It perfectly mirrors the extractive structure we've historically seen imposed on Latin America or parts of Southeast Asia. It is the highly predictable, engineered result of what economists call neoliberal shock therapy.
Okay, so we have laid out the design, the ruthless incentives, and the devastating outcomes. But here's the part I always struggle to understand when we look at these systems. If this system is this obviously detrimental to the vast majority of the population, why does the public tolerate it? Why aren't millions of people marching in the streets every single day? And I guess this brings us to phase 4. Persistence.
Persistence is arguably the most complex part of the machine, and it's maintained almost entirely through highly sophisticated perception management. We absolutely have to talk about propaganda. And what's interesting is that Chomsky clearly distinguishes between two very different, distinct types of propaganda within our system: treetops propaganda and grassroots propaganda.
Treetops propaganda sounds like it's aimed at birds, but it's actually aimed at the elites, right?
Right. Treetops propaganda is carefully targeted at the highly educated professional class, the political decision makers, the corporate managers, the academics, the journalists. Honestly, the people who are probably listening to a deep dive analysis like this one. The primary goal of treetops propaganda isn't to tell these people exactly what to think, but rather to rigidly set the bounds of expressible thought.
This is the famous media filter concept.
Exactly. The mainstream media doesn't dictate your specific opinion. Instead, it dictates what topics are even allowed to be debated in polite society. The text uses media coverage of the Vietnam War as the quintessential perfect example of this mechanism.
Right, the hawks versus the doves. That was the entirety of the allowable debate on television.
Yes, in the respectable mainstream media, in the New York Times, on the nightly news, the fierce, lively debate was strictly constrained. On one side, you had the hawks, who argued, "We can win this war, we just need more troops and more bombing." On the other side, you had the doves, who argued, "The war is becoming too costly, it's a strategic mistake, and we need to negotiate a withdrawal."
Which, to an average viewer, looks like a totally free and open democratic debate. It covers both sides, doesn't it?
But does it actually? Think about what is fundamentally missing from that spectrum of allowable debate.
I suppose the idea that we literally had no right to be there in the first place.
Much more than that. The glaring objective truth that the invasion of Vietnam was an act of supreme international aggression, an illegal war, and a massive crime against humanity. That specific, historically accurate viewpoint is completely excluded from the mainstream spectrum. It is not considered a respectable position to hold if you want to be on television or write a prominent column. By allowing incredibly lively, passionate debate only between the hawk and dove positions, the system fundamentally reinforces the unstated underlying assumption, which is that the United States has the inherent right to militarily intervene wherever it wants. We are just having a polite disagreement about the tactics and the cost.
Wow. So the lively debate itself actually serves to deeply limit our critical thinking. It makes us feel like we live in a remarkably free, open society because people are passionately arguing on television, but they are arguing inside a tiny, heavily reinforced ideological box.
Exactly. It creates the comforting illusion of genuine dissent while efficiently manufacturing consent for the overarching system. That's the treetops. Then you have grassroots propaganda. This is designed for what the elites internally refer to as the vulgar masses.
And the goal there isn't setting debate boundaries, it's something else entirely.
The goal for the grassroots is total distraction, intense oversimplification, and keeping people in a constant state of emotional agitation about things that don't threaten the economic structure.
You and your television.
That is the phrase the text uses. The system explicitly wants to isolate individuals. If the basic fundamental social unit of society is just you and your television screen, or today, you and your smartphone, you are totally atomized. You aren't talking to your neighbors about rent prices. You aren't organizing a union at your workplace. You are just passively consuming entertainment or getting angry at a manufactured culture war.
There is a really powerful, specific point made in the text about Social Security that ties into this atomization. The relentless political attack on Social Security isn't actually about balancing the federal budget. It's about destroying a core human idea.
The idea of solidarity. Social Security is deeply dangerous to the oligarchy because it is fundamentally based on a specific moral premise. An injury to one is an injury to all. We are in this life together. We collectively pool our resources to care for the elderly and the disabled because it is our shared social responsibility as a community.
And the neoliberal system absolutely hates that concept.
It despises it. The system desperately wants to replace that solidarity with a hyper-individualistic mindset. Look out for number one. The push for the privatization of Social Security, or turning it into individual stock market accounts, isn't actually about economic efficiency. It's about systematically breaking that psychological bond of social responsibility. If you are deeply, constantly worried about the fluctuating value of your own personal 401k, you stop caring about the common good of your neighbor. You start viewing your neighbor as an economic competitor.
It also mentions how the very language we use in the news is deliberately redefined to serve this persistence. Like the specific way the word jobs has completely replaced the word profits in political rhetoric.
That is a subtle but absolutely brilliant piece of linguistic propaganda. When ExxonMobil, or a massive defense contractor, secures a $40 billion government deal or a massive tax break, the evening news doesn't run the headline. Exxon secures massive private profits at taxpayer expense.
Right, they say, massive new deal brings jobs for Americans.
Exactly. Even if the actual deal only creates a tiny handful of administrative jobs, or if those jobs are entirely temporary or easily outsourced. By constantly substituting the word jobs for the word profits, it frames corporate looting of the public treasury as a noble public service. It makes it virtually impossible for a politician to criticize the corporate giveaway without immediately sounding like they are anti-worker or anti-job.
So we are intentionally atomized, endlessly distracted, and the very language we use to describe our reality is manipulated, which seamlessly brings us to phase 5, interconnection. How does this entire massive machine loop back on itself to constantly reinforce its own power?
It functions as a massive, self-sustaining feedback loop. Let's trace it. Concentrated corporate influence uses its massive wealth to literally buy policy design, for example, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which the text explicitly highlights as arguably the biggest corporate giveaway of public assets in modern history.
Which, if I remember correctly, is the law that allowed for massive, unprecedented media consolidation.
Exactly. So corporate influence directly buys a favorable policy.
Yeah.
That policy legally allows for massive capital and media concentration, meaning fewer but much bigger mega corporations controlling all the information. That intense concentration naturally leads to vastly weaker labor unions and a severely weakened, fragmented public voice, which in turn leads to
Even more unchecked corporate influence.
it is a continuous, accelerating spiral. The rich get vastly richer, the politically powerful get more powerful, and the general public gets pushed further and further to the absolute margins of the decision-making process.
And what's truly terrifying is that this isn't just a domestic American loop. It is locked into place globally by international institutions.
This is a crucial point. This is the specific role of organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, along with massive free trade agreements like NAFTA. They are intentionally designed to lock these neoliberal economic reforms into place permanently, effectively insulating them from the threat of local democracy.
Meaning even if a country actually manages to vote for a totally different economic path?
The international treaties effectively make it illegal for them to actually take that path. If a newly elected democratic population votes for, say, the nationalization of their own water supply, or extremely strong environmental protections against a mining company, they will likely be sued in secret corporate tribunals by the World Trade Organization, or they will be brutally sanctioned and economically starved by the IMF. Democracy, the actual will of the people, is routinely and legally overruled by supreme international investor rights.
The text mentions a fascinating detail, though. It notes that even some of the most prominent financial elites, people like George Soros, occasionally get nervous about how extreme the system has become.
Yes. Both Soros and even mainstream cheerleaders of globalization like Thomas Friedman have these brief moments of panic where they realize the system might actually be too ruthless for its own survival. Soros specifically worries about essentially killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. If the system crushes the working class consumer too severely, if it extracts too much wealth, who is left to actually buy the products that generate the corporate profits? It risks a total systemic collapse. But the tragedy is that the structural momentum of the oligarchy is so immense that even the individuals who benefit the most from it can't really hit the brakes. The machine just keeps grinding forward.
And this brings us to what I think is the most clarifying piece of evidence in the entire text: the public opinion disconnect. I really think this is the smoking gun that definitively proves we are not living in a functioning democracy.
The polling numbers the text cites are genuinely startling because they completely contradict the media narrative. Chomsky points to extensive polls showing that 95% of Americans believe corporations should significantly lower their profit margins for the direct benefit of their workers and the communities they operate in. 95%.
And 80% of the population believes the entire economic system is inherently fundamentally unfair.
Those are absolute landslide supermajority numbers. In any genuine functioning democracy, if 80 to 95% of the entire population demands a specific societal outcome, that outcome should rapidly become the law of the land.
But actual policy moves in the exact opposite direction.
Always. Despite these massive public numbers, we constantly get more regressive tax cuts for the ultra-rich, more corporate deregulation, and more brutal austerity for public services. This massive disconnect between what the public clearly wants and what the government actually does is the absolute definitive proof that the system is a managed oligarchy. The consent of the governed is manufactured where possible, but where manufacturing that consent fails, as the polls show, the system simply ignores the public entirely.
It is a deeply sobering, almost overwhelming picture. We've meticulously mapped out the design, the ruthless incentives, the physical outcomes, the propaganda of persistence, and the massive feedback loops of interconnection. But we need to tie this all explicitly together for the listener right now.
We do. We have to directly address the core analytical problem that the entire book is pointing toward.
So, what is the crisis in perception here?
The profound crisis in perception is that we are constantly looking at deliberate architecture and we are falsely calling it weather.
Explain that, because that is a remarkably powerful image.
We have been intensely conditioned to perceive the modern economy as if it were a totally uncontrollable force of nature. We say things like, globalization is inevitable, treating it like the ocean tide coming in. We casually say, wages are low because of global market forces, treating it like the indisputable law of gravity. But this deep systems-level analysis explicitly reveals that these aren't natural laws at all. They are very specific designs. They are calculated, deliberate choices made by incredibly powerful people sitting in very specific rooms designed to achieve the exact outcomes we're experiencing.
And we also deeply misperceive the very nature of democracy itself.
Yes. The second major misperception is that we lazily equate democracy merely with the formal act of holding elections. We are taught to think that simply because we get to cast a ballot every 2 or 4 years between two essentially corporate-funded political parties, we are a truly free society. But we fail to realize that the actual substance of societal decision-making, how we direct our massive investments, what we choose to produce, how we distribute technological advancements, has been entirely removed from the democratic public sphere and placed exclusively in the unaccountable hands of private corporate tyrannies.
So the misperception is essentially believing that the game is basically fair, perhaps just a little flawed, when in reality the core rules were specifically written centuries ago to ensure the House absolutely always wins.
Precisely. And there is one final crucial layer to this crisis. It has to do with how we view corruption. As a society, we focus almost all of our political outrage on individual corruption scandals. We get incredibly angry when a single politician is caught illegally taking a bribe or embezzling funds. But the true crisis in perception is our collective failure to see that the system isn't broken when that illegal bribery happens. The system is working exactly as intended. The completely legal, day-to-day functioning of the system, the massive corporate lobbying, the billions in legalized campaign finance, the seamless revolving door between government regulators and the industries they supposedly regulate, that legal architecture is infinitely more damaging to the common good than any isolated instance of illegal corruption.
The real scandal isn't what is secretly illegal. The real scandal is what they have made perfectly legal.
Exactly. Systems-level analysis completely shifts our worldview. It reveals that concentrated private power isn't an accidental byproduct of a free market. It is the deliberate structural core of the system itself. The ultimate crisis is our ongoing inability to plainly see the private tyranny of the massive modern corporation for what it truly is, an immensely powerful political institution that is fundamentally entirely incompatible with the existence of true democracy. Until we can accurately perceive that basic structural reality, we're just blindly fighting shadows on the wall.
That is the incredibly clarifying thought we need to leave you with today. It is not about trying to find a slightly better, more ethical CEO. It's about finally understanding the true nature of the barrel we are all trapped in.
And crucially, realizing that once we see the blueprints, we actually possess the collective power to build a completely new one.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.